You know, when we made the shark film, we'd been sitting out in the boat for 2 days trying to find a shark. I was skippering the camera boat, Don Clay was shooting, and at one stage Ron said, "Hey Oz, we're going to pull in the baits." And I thought, pull in the baits? There must have been a shark there. They pulled in the baits and we cruised over after that, and I said, "What'd you pull in the baits for?" He said, "Mate, there was a Noah here that was longer than our boat, and we just didn't want to get tangled with him." You'll enjoy this little film we've made.
When Wayne Hanstead and I went to Port Stephens and Southwest Rocks to look for sharks, we had quite an experience. For one thing, we learned that sharks are a lot harder to find than you might imagine. And when you do find them, they can cause you all sorts of problems, especially when you fish from a small boat like ours. The high peaks guarding the entrance to Port Stephens are a familiar sight to game fishermen. Every year they bring their boats here to fish the Game Fish Tournament, possibly one of the biggest annual events on the game fishing calendar. This area is a haven for all sorts of fishermen. The amateur, looking for nothing more than a quiet moment of relaxation, and the professional, his work finished, thankful for the security of a safe anchorage in peaceful waters. As far as fishermen go, Port Stephens sees them all. Small game and big game. This is a typical big game cruiser, the sort of thing you'd use if you wanted to catch a shark. And this is not a typical game fishing boat, but today it will be used to fish for sharks. Catching a shark from any boat is quite a thrill, and Wayne Hanstead and I were working on the idea that the smaller the boat, the bigger the thrill. The amount of risk involved in this sort of adventure is in direct proportion to the size of the shark, and you have no way of controlling the situation. It's just a matter of putting out the baits, laying down a burley trail, and then waiting to see what happens. It's all something of a lucky dip. The first thing we needed was fresh bait and some burley to attract the sharks. These little islands are like ocean-going supermarkets. Bait fish come into the white water looking for shelter, and big fish work the edges of the white water looking for the bait. On a good day, it's just a matter of throwing in a lure and pulling out a fish, and this was a good day. The water around this island was alive with small fish. Our biggest problem was that there seemed to be 50 kingfish for every bonito, and since bonito make a much better bait than kingfish, we had to work our way through a whole bunch of kings to get the bonnies we wanted. On another day, this sort of fishing would be an end in itself. A man could have a ball in a situation like this, fishing light tackle, but today it was all a means to an end, and our approach was not exactly what you might call a sporting one. The kings at that spot finally wore us down, and we moved on, looking for an area with a few more bonito. Wayne thought he might get the job done with his super secret, homemade special bonito lure he'd hidden from me in the cabin. And then I went and ruined his whole day by catching a bonito with the same lure he'd just taken off. As a matter of fact, the homemade special did turn out to be a red-hot bonito lure, and in no time at all, Wayne was really starting to sack them up. If you're not careful, you can come home with a lot of strange parts in your hair when you fish this way from a small boat. It's a very good idea to stay on friendly terms with your fishing buddy. Once we had the main school of bonnies located, it didn't take long to land all the fish we needed for bait and the burley pot. We took only as many fish as we needed for the job at hand, and we left them biting. The fish we left would grow, and those we took would eventually feed other fish. Some people condemn game fishermen for catching fish that can't be eaten, but game fishermen return almost everything they catch to the sea, where it becomes food for other marine creatures. In a way, their sport blends with the natural feeding chain. The kings found us again, and you really have to hand it to these fish. We were working with the most powerful 20-pound jig rods available, and yet these little kings were really giving us a hard time. A proper game boat has a burley bucket mounted on the stern, and a burley bucket serves two purposes. It makes it easy to lay down a trail to attract game fish to the boat, and at the same time helps to keep a respectable distance between the fisherman and his burley, which at times can get to be quite a potent old brew. Our burley arrangements, like our boat, were something of a compromise. Without the proper mincer, I used a plastic garbage bin to concoct a very powerful soup. The bonito fillets were kept aside for baits, and everything else went into the soup pot. Wayne used his head and stayed as far away from the burley as he could get. I was quite proud of the soup myself, but Wayne's reaction was something less than complimentary. With that little job out of the way, it was time to get on with the business of finding a shark. In the weeks prior to our trip, most of the eastern rivers had been in flood, and the water right along the coast was still very murky. But right in front of us, the outgoing tide was pushing a band of clear water several miles out to sea. These colour changes often attract big fish, and so we headed out with the idea of fishing on the drift and laying a burley trail right along the edge of the colour change. With storm clouds beginning to show in the south, we had our fingers crossed when we eventually started to fish. We knew we were only going to get one day in here, and we wanted to make the most of it. We used balloons to float our baits because they're easy to see in choppy water. The balloons are tied to the main line with cotton and break free almost as soon as the bait is taken. This way, they don't offer any resistance to a touchy fish, and by keeping our eyes open, we know about it the moment we're in business. You'll notice who got stuck with that burley soup again. And speaking of soup, the customers are really starting to queue up out there. Mutton birds have to be the greatest little line tanglers and bait stealers in the business. I must confess to having a soft spot for these little thieves though, and a bag keeps them quiet until they can be untangled and sent on their way unharmed. We must have drifted inshore for more than 2 miles, laying down a burley trail all the way. A 2-mile-long invitation to dinner that was eventually accepted by the whole gang. And when they arrived, they wasted no time getting down to business. The first shark to reach the bait took it, and I gave him all the time he wanted to eat it right down, and then I made sure that hook went in good and solid. This shark was in the 300 to 400 pound range, and right from the start we had problems with the tackle and the small boat. A shoulder harness is great when you have somewhere to brace yourself, but in a pitching boat with low rails, it just helps a big fish to break your back. This was to be the start of the most miserable hour I've ever spent fishing. I had to get rid of that harness, and if you want to know how much a big fish can hurt a fisherman, just try pulling on a stiff 30-pound rod for an hour, freestanding on the deck of a lively boat. There was one other small complication. This fish seemed to know more about shark fishing than I did. Your back gets to hurt the most when the fish is straight under the boat, and that's right where this one wanted to stay, along with half a dozen of his friends who followed us the whole time. For personal reasons, I don't like to use the boat to beat a fish, but I had no choice with this one. I had no chance of getting the leverage I needed to lift him when he was under the boat, and Wayne had a full-time job on his hands trying to keep that shark out to one side where I could work on him. Time and time again we ran that boat away, and every single time he dived right back underneath again. After 45 minutes of this sort of punishment, my back was stiff enough to make a useful ironing board. But we were learning some interesting lessons the hard way. A stiff rod, for example, is fine if you can brace yourself well enough to load it. But under these conditions, it actually works as a lever against the fisherman. We were already thinking in terms of more specialised rods. Rods designed to load up a lot closer to the body would obviously make it easier to balance and give the fisherman a lot more leverage against the fish. When you keep this sort of pressure on for a full hour, something has to give. You spend a lot of time thinking about the knots you tied in that trace, and through the rod, you can actually feel the shark rolling down there. Every time that big tail thumps against the trace, you think about how much damage he's doing to the line, and can't help wondering if he's still going to beat you at the last minute. I don't mind admitting that I was pretty close to the end of my tether when that shark finally gave in. Slowly at first, then coming easier with gentle persuasion, he came to the top and started to circle the boat. This fish had fought himself to a standstill, and with the wiring gloves and gaffs ready, we were hoping he wouldn't give us too much trouble in the final stages. But we needn't have worried. Right at the side of the boat, he gave one quick roll in the trace and broke free. Losing a fish like that can be pretty demoralising, but if you want to catch big fish, you just have to accept the fact that they are going to be a lot harder to beat than the small ones. Every part of the tackle is subjected to brutal punishment, and the chances of failure are very high in a long, drawn-out fight. But we still had 6 sharks sitting right under the boat, and getting another hookup was simply a matter of putting another bait over the side. This time Wayne tried a kidney harness with the same rod and found the going a lot easier taking the strain lower on his back. But we had a new problem now. The long fight with the last shark had done a lot more damage to the line than we'd thought, and this one was a runner. Line friction was burning the damaged nylon up as it went out over the guides, and Wayne was faced with a tough decision. He could waste hours trying to ease the shark up to the boat and still stand a good chance of losing it. Or he could go for broke and try for a quick decision either way. Wayne made the decision to step the fight up and try for a quick kill. And when Wayne knuckles down on a fish, he really knows how to put the pressure on. In no time at all, I was getting the wiring gloves on, ready to take the trace. And then we ran out of luck again. With only 50 feet left to go, the line finally broke, and once more, we were left with egg on our face. With sharks still swimming right under the boat, it was obviously time for a change in tactics. We were beginning to think that the heavy rod has no place in a small boat, no matter how big the fish, and I decided to try for another one on ultralight tackle.